as we think about the war, what war ends 11-11-11, right? 11-11, armistice. How is the war settled? What will settle the Great War?
World War II.
Okay, well, yeah, that's right. It's a prelude. We got an intermission. But the war itself is going to be settled at a place called Versailles. Wilson, because again he's a Democrat, and Hastert is always got to be about human beings and freedom. You know, that's what we Democrats do. You know, he's got to make this a moral war. It can't just be an economic war, and everybody knows it's economic and territorial, right? But it's got to be moral. So he develops what to make it a moral war? 14 points, moral war. And the United States enters this war. You know, enters the war. It's a moral war. It ends. Wilson is woo woo. Wilson. The French are going woo woo ooh la la. Wilson. I don't think they said ooh la la, but they said Viva Wilson. Woo woo. And he comes over and everybody loves him. They're throwing flowers at him. And he gets to the conference, Versailles, and
he's essentially ignored by the other.
He is pretty much ignored. You know, pretty much ignored. Because they are pragmatists, you know, they are all looking for the good of their country, you know, and it ends up Wilson acquiesces. A lot of his ideas are in the treaty. I think it's unfair to say of the 14 points, the only one is the League of Nations. That's not true. You know, there's self-determination for, you know, the people in Austria, the people in the Ottoman Empire. You know, there's a lot of stuff in there that's Wilsonian in the Treaty of Versailles. But the only pure point is the League of Nations. And it's settled, big reparations, all that kind of jazz. And Wilson comes home. And he really comes home to a different place. What country does he come back to?
One that was nothing to do with it.
Yeah, one that's beginning to question, why did we do this? I mean, we start the war with about 114,000 troops in the army. That was our standing army, 114. We lose in deaths 160,000 in this war. You know, so we lose more than we had at the beginning. You know, and it cost us an enormous amount of money. Not counting what we supplied to the other allies. You know, and Europe is doing the same thing. Europe always does. You know, always does. And the only thing that it appears the United States really gets out of this war is a League of Nations which seems to do what to American sovereignty?
Invade ours.
Exactly. Now, if there's a dispute, we can't settle it. We're not supposed to settle it. What are we supposed to do? Go to some of the distinguished members of the League, like Mussolini's Italy, you know, in a few years. Mussolini's Italy, Imperial Japan, and have them give their moral judgment on the issue that we face. Good idea? Really? You know, so the United States isn't all that fond about being more closely connected with the world. You know, so we've got after the war. Now it's really interesting. We have all these. It seems as the pendulum kind of swings. It's when we have real big internal issues that we kind of swing towards isolationism. And if a politician can convince Americans that the internal issues are greater than the external, then the pendulum swings towards isolation. It's like we can't do both at the same time. And that's really what sort of happens after World War I. And that's what we're going to talk about today, these interwar years. You know, the first thing is, you know, we talked about it last time. Something happened. Wilson comes back to the United States after the Treaty of Versailles is signed, and Wilson thinks he has done a great thing, and he is going to be welcomed in the United States as a hero, and because he's Woodrow Wilson, you know, everybody's going to love him, and he presents the League, this idea, the treaty, to Congress, and Congress says, no, we got problems. We got problems with this treaty. You know, there are problems with this treaty. And Wilson, what's interesting is, you know, Congress is willing to negotiate because it's a Democrat. There's a Democratic majority in Congress, so it's not like he's dealing with only Republicans. That's going to change in 1920. But you know, he's dealing with they got problems, and really what they're saying, what they say to him is, we can tweak certain things. Let's tweak certain things. And Congress is even part of the deal is. They're even willing to give him his League. You know, give him the League, but we got to tweak certain things. And Wilson says,
no. It's my way or the highway.
It's my way or the highway. It's going to be, this is the treaty. This is the treaty.
Who was the leader, Lodge?
Lodge is, yeah.
The big.
Yeah, Lodge is going to be the big Republican, you know. But that's what this is, you know, it's got to be my way, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to rally the Americans. And so he goes out on a speaking tour, 1919, and has a stroke. And they take him back to Washington. He's not speaking anymore. He's got, you know, it's just kind of a mess, you know. And so in 1919, moving into 1920, you know, we've also got all these soldiers coming home. Now, we've talked about that before in another class, if you remember. What's the problem after war? What makes the time after wars really, really dangerous, even if you win?
No jobs.
The soldiers are coming back for jobs at the very time industries are doing what? Gearing back. You know, so you got all these soldiers who gave their lives, willing to sacrifice their lives for their country, coming back for jobs at the time that the guys who are making shirts don't have government contracts anymore. And so they got to go to pre-war production, which means they're laying people off right at a time where you're dumping 1 million people into the economy.
Right.
And that's a problem. That's a problem. You're also talking about prices, farm prices particularly. Doing what? Falling because there's not the same demand. You know, so the economy is under a lot of stress right after war. Demobilization is terrible, can be terrible.
The soldiers are supposed to get money from the government. They didn't get.
They're supposed to get a bonus. And that is typical throughout history. Because the army almost mutinied after the Revolution because they were promised bonuses. Western territory that the Congress didn't give. Unfortunately, the Congress couldn't give it because land speculators had bought up all the land in the West, and so there was no land for them to give to the soldiers, land that they had promised going into the war. So things never change. Never change. So anyway, we've got all this economic stress going on. You know, we got these people being dumped back into the economy. We got industry trying to figure out, you know, how can I absorb all these people and at the same time, you know, reduce production? You know, how can I live in a post-war world? There's a lot of stuff going on internally. And Wilson is still saying the most important focus is overseas. Yes, League of Nations. It's overseas. It's settling the Great War that we haven't been fighting for 2 years. You know, that's the big issue. In 1920, Woodrow Wilson wants to run for president. He's willing and anxious to run for a third term. Good that he didn't because he dies in 1921. You know, but he wants to run again even though he's had a stroke. You know, he's not bedridden anymore, but he still wants to run. Democrats, he is not popular now because people want to go back to the focus on America. And so we have this real interesting election in 1920 where you have two dark horses. And you know what a dark horse is?
Doesn't have a chance of finishing.
Yeah, well, yes, a guy who wasn't even considered for nomination ends up getting it. You know, and we really end up with two dark horses, both for the glorious state of Ohio, running against one another. And Harding, who is senator from Ohio, newspaper publisher. Cox, who is governor of Ohio, newspaper publisher. You know, Cox Cable is his family. Yeah. Run against one another. Harding is a Republican, Cox is a Democrat. You know, both of them focus on internal stuff. Wilson is really irritated with his party because he wants this election to be a referendum on the Treaty of Versailles. That's what he wants, and that's not how Cox is running. Cox is running for a domestic campaign, looking at domestic issues. So is Harding. And Harding's, you know, there are certain slogans become really important, you know, in the images they project. If you remember in I don't think it was 1980 he used it, I think he used it in 84. I'm looking at Georgia because she would know, being a newspaper person. Ronald Reagan's slogan of Morning in America, I think that was 84. Yeah, when he ran against Mondale. Morning in America. And if you remember those commercials, those Reagan commercials, you know, sun coming up, you know, family eating breakfast, kids playing in the neighborhood, you know, and the content was no content, no political content, but it was Morning in America. We're entering a morning in America. Things are going to be wonderful. Are going to be wonderful. This is good. And Mondale is talking about issues and and Reagan is Morning in America, Morning in America, and people, you know what? People like Morning in America, you know, Morning in America. They like that, and it's not that people obey it, but you know, I don't know about you, but sometimes I get overloaded, you know, material overload, you know, and maybe I just want a leader that's going to make me feel better about life, you know, and that's what Reagan does. This is what Harding does, because he talks about a return to normalcy. You know, remember, and what's really interesting, and Cox is really progressive, so a lot of his stuff is progressive then. Harding is marginally. The return to normalcy is this progressive era. This is the Roosevelt and the Wilson before the war. But you don't have to be specific, right? You're just going to return to what?
Sunshine.
Sun coming up in the morning. You know, people eating breakfast around the table. Children playing in the street. You know, we're returning to normalcy, right? And so they run, and what we end up having is we return to that traditional pattern, you know, election pattern that we had before Woodrow Wilson and that split in the Republican Party. Cox ends up doing what? Carrying the solid South, with the exception of Tennessee, because Eastern Tennessee has always been more Republican than the rest of Tennessee. So, you know, Eastern Tennessee is out, you know, kind of that way. But, you know, the Republicans, you know, kind of run the board. And the Democrats keep their strong point, you know, their strong areas. It's interesting that the socialists have a segment. They draw 3% of the popular vote. But we elect a president, Harding, who is Warren G. Harding, who is one of the best looking guys in the United States. He is. He is supposed to be one of the best looking guys. You know, just a dashing man.
And there was scandal.
What's that?
And there was scandal.
And, yeah. There's a lot of scandal. Well, bless his heart, Warren G. Harding, Gamaliel Harding, was not the sharpest knife in the drawer. He was not the shiniest apple on the tree. You know, he's a person that said he should not have been president. He should not have been president.
He was playing hockey with a work puck.
Yes. Oh, I like that. That's pretty good. I would say playing football with a deflated ball,
There you
but that's
go.
what my
That's
Colts
good.
ended up having to do against the Patriots. All right, so, but thank you very much. I'm going to be here all week. We've got 1920. So Harding wins the election, and what there's a little irony, and I just throw this out. Cox is going to live after he loses it. He leaves politics and focuses on media. Cox is going to die in 1957. He is in that election. You have four people: president, vice president, vice president. He is running. Harding runs. His vice presidential candidate is Calvin Coolidge, and Calvin Coolidge is going to become president because Harding is going to die, in office. Cox, his running mate is. Well, who his running mate is? He is Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
Franklin Roosevelt.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt is his running mate in 1920. And he's going to be president. Of the four people on that involved in that election, he is the only one that isn't going to be president. Is Cox, but he's going to outlive the rest of them.
That's something. His army, when was that?
Cox's army?
Oh, yeah.
Boy, I don't know. I don't.
They
I
that
wanted
was-
the money, they wanted the,
Yeah, wasn't that?
Yeah, he ran that army to Washington. He was a real progressive guy.
Yeah, I don't know. I can check on it, but I don't know.
I think it was afterwards.
Yeah,
Probably
that I don't know.
In the Depression.
Yeah, I'll check on it. I'll tell you now.
Because that was.
Yeah, if it's the same
Well,
time.
Well, it could be. the-
Yeah, I don't know. See, I don't know.
know.
Because what I read about it didn't mention that, so I'll have to check.
Cox's army.
All right. Okay, so we got the election. Harding is president of the United States, and we're going to return to normalcy. Now, one of the things that's important to remember, you were talking about foreign policy, the United States under Harding doesn't step back into isolationism. File that away, because usually when this is covered, the assumption is Republicans win, boom, we become isolationists. But we don't. Because remember, that's not part of the Republican, ethos. It's not part of who they are, isolationists. So we don't become isolated. Now, focus on domestic issues, yes, but we're not going to be isolationists. In fact, we don't become truly isolationists until the 1930s. 1930s. And who was president during most of the 30s? Roosevelt, who is? Just saying. So this isn't. We're still very much engaged in the world, not unlike the engagement before the war. Okay. So I'm not willing to say the pendulum has swung back to isolationism. Not yet. Now Harding is a dim bulb. That's just the way it is. He's a dim bulb. But there are things that he does. One of the things that we see happen is the naval disarmament. There's naval disarmament, focusing on the Washington Naval Conference, and the Washington Naval Conference is really kind of interesting, and this is under Republican leadership, calling certain nations of the world. What nations would you call for a naval conference? Because remember, the United States has far more interest in naval things than Army. I mean, Army is not particularly relevant. Treaty of Versailles took care of a lot of the Army too. Okay, you're going to definitely call. If you're going to call a naval conference, you got to call it.
Britain, Germany, France.
Okay, well, it won't be Germany. They're going to call Britain. They're going to call France. Japan. Gotta call Japan, right? Who else would they call?
Russia.
Well, the problem with Russia. What's going on in Russia? Early 1920s. Oh, they haven't. Most of the world still hasn't recognized the Soviet Union. So we're not calling Russia, and Russian Navy is negligible. What's that?
They're
Yeah,
right.
well, it's negligible.
much.
They're dealing with internal stuff. Who else would you say?
Italy.
Yeah, people. Italy. Italy is going to be
Italy,
called
yeah.
because by this time Mussolini's in power and Mussolini's beginning to increase their armaments. And they call some other. Belgium is involved in the conference because Belgium has a respectable navy. They've got foreign possessions, and any country that has foreign possessions needs some kind of navy. Because the Netherlands is invited. to the conference. Those are the nations that are involved in this naval conference. And the naval conference does several things. When you think, now this political cartoon is a naval conference. Now, the United States is carrying, this is Uncle Sam carrying his great big navy to this naval conference. How does he leave the conference? Wearing a barrel, you know, because the naval conference, by this editorial cartoonist, is saying what? The United States gave up its great navy, and ends up with a barrel, and then they're returning to the London conference with only the barrel. So what else are they going to give up? You know, but the naval conference and it was a series of 3. It ended up 3 agreements. One involves Asia. Now, why would Asia navies, or why would the navies be involved, or these great powers be involved in disputes in Asia?
Because of the colony.
Okay, we got colonies. The French have colonies. The British have colonies. You know, the Dutch have colonies. You know, the Dutch East Indies, what is Indonesia, is Dutch territory. Japan, my gosh, Japan. You still got China that is in the middle of its endless civil wars. You know, in China, you know, China's still exploitable. What the United States doesn't want is to get drawn into some kind of a military conflict in Asia. You know, and so one of the things, one of the agreements is that, again, we're going to respect the open door policy. You know, there's going to be a mechanism for resolving disputes in Asia. Okay? The other agreement, which is, I find that it's called the 5-Power Agreement, I find even more interesting. You've got these major powers. What has been the greatest navy historically? For 200, 300 years. England, okay. And one of the problems before World War I was Germany was building a big navy, and Britain feels threat. What from this naval conference, the 5-Power Agreement, five powers at this conference agree to do something that has never been done. They're going to cut back on battleships and even aircraft carriers. They're going to cut back on capital ships and aircraft carriers. And what they end up agreeing on, in essence, and they do it in terms of tonnage, is the United States if you say 5, United States will be a 5. And Britain will be 5. So they have the highest, they're allowed to build the highest tonnage. That's why that picture, he comes in with the Navy and leaves with nothing. Because the United States, coming after a war, may have to decommission ships, you know, to meet the tonnage requirement. You know, but they can be equal to Britain. So if there are 5, Japan becomes a 3. So Japan is going to have 60% of what Britain, United States had. So they're going to be 3 in terms of tonnage. And then both France and Italy agree to a tonnage limit. You know, so what they do, this is the first disarmament conference. Nations are agreeing not only on limits, but actually disarmament. You know, which is kind of what Wilson wanted. You know, that nations would work out their problems rather than go to war. This is kind of what he was talking about. And this is really a big deal. Now, you know, we look at it from a perspective of history and say, boy, this naval conference, you know, United States, England equal, 60% to Japan, you know, Italy, Mussolini agrees to limit. Boy, oh boy, were they ever stupid, naive, you know, whatever word you want to use. But understand, after the Great War, the war to end war, the assumption really was that nobody really wants to do this again. You know, nobody wants to do this again. It's sort of like nuclear disarmament. The Soviets don't want to blow us up. We don't want to blow the Soviets up. We don't want to do that. So why can't we agree to just cut back? You know, we can't, if we agree to not do it, you know, we were both building to compete with, but maybe since neither one want to do it, maybe we can start cutting back. Duh. Save some money. Duh. You know, and that's what they're saying. You know, we all have enough economic problems after the war. Why are we escalating naval costs when we can all sit down at a table and say, this is stupid? Instead of building another battleship or aircraft carrier, maybe we should build a factory, pump money into the economy. Maybe we should do that instead. You know, that was the Washington Naval Conference. That's a big deal. You know, the Dawes Plan. Oh, but Steve was still involved internationally. Coming out of the war. We'll do the Dawes Plan and then give you a break. Coming out of the war, what's the big issue for Germany? I mean, they lost the war, you know, okay, they lost the war. What will become the big issue for Germany? Reparations. Because what France in particular wants, because the war was fought in France, what does France want after the war? They want Germany to pay the cost of the war, right? You know, it was theirs, you know. Yeah, they started it, right, exactly. When Maggie wants to take a friend out to dinner, she should what? She should pay for it, right? And if I give her 20, not only do I want change, I want the 20 back, you know. Right, you pay for, you know, if you use it, you pay for it. And that's what France did. And it's war fought in France, so we have France having the most, you know, having lost the most. You know, and so France wants German reparations. They want the war paid back, and they want it paid back in gold. They want it paid back in gold. None of that money. You know, none of that money. We wanted no monopoly money. You know, got to be paid back in gold. Got to be shining at you. The trouble is, Germany doesn't have it. And as Germany is scraping together the money to pay France, what is it not spending money to do?
Its own economy.
They are basket cakes, an economic basket case. Yeah, and so things get even worse.
Well, one of the things, though, the Germans complain about that treaty, but the treaty they made the Russians is it equally as bad or even worse?
Far worse.
Yeah.
You know what the Russian. If anybody believes that if Germany had won the war, they would have been more benevolent to the French than the French were to the German, they are dead wrong. You know, they are dead wrong. The Germans, they would. And in fact, what was, you know, when you mentioned that, what was weird about the treaty with the Russians is it ended up hurting Germany. Because they forced the Russians to turn over so much land. You know, there wouldn't be German land, but would be created in German satellite states. They required Russia to turn over so much land. They had to maintain 1 million troops, German troops in the east, just to police the land that the Russians had turned over, that they had annexed. Troops that could have been what? Used on the Western Front. They had to keep in the east because the Germans required such a huge amount of land from the Russians. Of course, the Germans and the German reparations were huge on the Soviets, because it's the Soviets that negotiated the treaty. And the Soviets, if you don't think Germany has money after the war, the Soviets have nothing, because they're fighting a civil war. You know, so it was ludicrous. If the German, you know, if the Germans had been benevolent, it could have been very different. But they weren't. They acted like Germans. I'm a Rudiger. I can say it. Yeah, I can say it. All right. Okay, go and urinate. You know, I don't want to put pressure on you. Oh, kind of interesting. But, so if you don't need to, just hang around the bathroom.
I hope I got power.
What did you say about you said something
We had started it, but
Okay, let's get
two different. My birth certificate, my whole life, until I went on that trip, was illegal. And our seal was never registered in Hancock County, so I had to go to Jefferson County, Columbus, and the name was there, and then.
Wow, that's really something. Okay.
Have you been down there for a while?
Well, do you like it? I mean, it's to die for.
It's chilly.
See, I haven't.
I don't want to die in there.
I never did. I don't. All right, let's do Dawes Plan. Now, the Germans have a really hard time paying reparations, right? They can't afford it.
Yeah, they
And yeah, they're in trouble.
They're like Russia.
Yes, they're like Russia. But the French are not happy. And when the Russians, thank you, when the Germans default on one of the reparation payments to France, France does what the treaty allows it to do. It occupies. Well, they've already taken Alsace. They occupy the Ruhr Basin.
Yeah.
And the Ruhr Basin is the heart of German.
Gold and steel.
Right. And so when you occupy that, and the intention was, to run it for France, to pay the bills. It's like what? Repo. That's what they're doing. They're taking the Ruhr. German industry then collapses, and they have even less money. And Germany decides to do something which is really crazy. When the French occupy the Ruhr as a way to stick it to the French, that's when the Germans start printing money. Just creating huge amounts of money, which causes not only the German industry to collapse, but the German economy.
Inflation goes
To climb. You get this hyperinflation, and it's to stick the French who are sitting in the Ruhr Basin, because now they're constantly having to pay more and more and more and more and more. It is insane, and getting less and less and less out of it. So
it hurt the whole country.
Oh, it devastates everything.
There were stories about people that they got paid daily, and they had suitcases full of money. They could barely buy a loaf of bread.
In this period, they talked about when you're in hyperinflation. When in the past you would go to the store, carry your money in your wallet, and take your goods out in a basket. When you're in hyperinflation, you carry a basket of money and leave with something you can fit in your wallet. Hyperinflation is a terrible. People were papering their walls with mark notes because it was cheaper than wallpaper.
Oh my gosh.
That's when they started issuing 50 billion mark notes.
50 billion.
15 billion mark notes.
Oh, wow.
In other words, the paper is worth more than the money.
They printed it only on one side because it wasn't worth printing it on both sides.
Oh my God.
Wow.
You're talking about
No wonder
unbelievable.
So if they had the technology for today and everybody was sitting there and you could just print your own money and they probably wouldn't care.
Well, that's exactly right, because it wasn't worth anything.
There was no such thing as counterfeiting.
Prices were changing, by the minute. You wanted to shop early because prices would be higher by the end of the day. It was awful. So Germany is a basket case. Dawes Plan, and this is really coming out of this war. The United States is really the only country that, even the Allies that has a lot of money, because they didn't spend as much as the others to fight a 4-year war. And so, with the Dawes Plan, and what the United States does is it loans Germany $2.5 billion.
That's a lot of money back.
$2.5 billion.
a lot of money.
In gold.
Whoa, wow.
Loans Germany $2.5 billion. Germany will take that money, and this is all part of the deal, will take that money and pay the other allies, because the United States isn't getting reparations. Will take the $2 billion and pay the allies the money the allies They owe the Allies in reparation. And then the Allies will take the money and pay it to the United States, because the United States has loans. The Allies borrowed money from the United States to finance the war.
The United States makes money on this deal.
Well, the United States loans it, they give it, the Allies give it back.
So they get back their
They get back the money. Yes, that's right.
Lose out at all.
Yeah, well, unless Germany, you're loaning it, if Germany still owes the United States money, Germany defaults on its loans, then the United States is out. You know, but that's what, and it's you know, you look at it and you say, what? You know what?
It had a certain beautiful simplicity about it.
Yeah.
It had gone as planned.
But I remember a little comedy routine that involves borrowing $1, and you know, well, you know, can I borrow $1? Well, somebody goes, well, you owe me $1. Okay, I'll give you the $1 I got. Well, yeah, you owe me $1, and so you know, that's what they end up doing. But the point is, this is an engagement in international affairs, and it's an engagement that involves business, and we're talking about 1924. You know, so this is something that's happening during this time that people usually say, oh, we've gone back to isolationism. We really haven't.
No.
We are really engaged.
This kind of stuff didn't happen before. This is
This
new.
this is new. This is new. Well, the United States, because the United States is really a player here.
Right.
You know, they are an integral player. They're not in the League of Nations, but they are really a financial player. The place that is decreased in importance, New York has increased, London has decreased. Because now that's going to be the center of
So
money.
this is like the start of the decline of the British Empire.
This is the British Empire is in decline. Is in decline.
What did the economists think at the time about this plan?
They thought it was brilliant.
I
For one, it's brilliant. It ends up, everybody is happy. You know, it causes the French to leave the Ruhr, because now the French are getting their payments,
Right.
and the French army leaves the Ruhr. Germany starts manufacturing again. They can pay off the Allies. The United States is getting in, and you know, it says to the U.S., but we're talking about particular banks. So it's not like the United States gets a passel of money. It goes to the banks who made the loans. So what's happening is we're financing, you know, a stronger economy. We're putting more capital into American banks.
Germany gets more prosperous in the last half of the 1920s.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, you know, which is really interesting. Germany comes out of this hyperinflation, and when the Nazi Party starts seeing itself as a national party, and that's after the failed putsch, you know, starts seeing itself as a national party and runs national candidates, they have a lot of problems early on. And in fact, when you move from one election to another, their very marginal vote decreases, because one of the things the Nazis are saying is, things are horrible, and we need to blame
Somebody.
the Jews, we need to blame the British, we need to blame the communists, we need to blame the Americans. It is, things are bad, we're going to solve your problems. Elect me and I'll solve your problems. And by 1929, 1928, the problems look like they're solving themselves.
It used to be.
Yeah, and you don't vote for the person. You vote, certain people win because they play on fear. I am afraid. You know, I am afraid. And that's what Hitler was counting on. You're afraid because your lifestyle is ending. You gotta vote for me, because I'm gonna preserve you. I'm the only one that can do it. I am the only one that can do it, and you gotta trust me. And if people are scared enough, they'll say, yes, we think you're a jerk, but yes. You know, we think you're unstable, but yes, you can save us. You know, you elect a savior. And that's what, by the end of the 20s, Germans aren't feeling that way anymore. Now what's going to happen? The Dawes Plan, you say, oh, this is the brilliant in its simplicity. When the Great Depression hits the United States,
Well, so that's another matter.
when the banks collapse, and remember, with depressions, The problem with you don't have inflationary depression. Depression occurs when prices go down, you know, and everything is pulled down. One of the things these American banks that have been loaning Germany money for 6 years, what those banks are going to do is they're going to start calling in the loans. And when they start calling in the loans to the German banks, because remember, this is all based on the United States having almost unlimited wealth. You know, when the United States doesn't, and a lot of their wealth is here, and the banks, instead of letting the loans float for their own survival, start calling them in, the German economy collapses.
Again.
Collapses again. And the early 1930s in Germany is horrible, but not inflationary. You know, they are hit with the Depression, Great Depression too. That's right, and industrial production tanks, people are out of work, it is horrible. And then, because one of the things Hitler was saying in 28 is, American loans, we owe too much to the Americans. And the Germans are saying, you know, why? Oh, who cares? You know, life is good now, we're paying them all, we'll pay them all. The economy will continue to prosper, we're fine. You gotta watch those bankers, those American bankers, those London bankers, we owe too much to them. And in 1930, it appeared as though Adolf Hitler was right. And the German people say, you know, all the other politicians were saying, things are going to be great. But this one guy said they aren't, and he said, trust me, and I'll return you to prosperity and glory. You know, he may be a kook, you know, and he may be a nasty individual, but you know, maybe he's right. And that's why they're going to, in 1932, the percentage vote that the Nazi Party gets is approaching now 50%. And so all of a sudden the party goes from marginal to really important because, in a sense, of the Dawes Plan when the United States starts calling in the loans. And the German economy collapses. Now, if the United States had done, if the banks had done something different, maybe, but the American banks were trying to survive.
This is interesting that the economy is playing, probably for the first time, is playing how the countries interact economically, that is playing out that it didn't do before.
Absolutely.
And it's causing all kinds of...
Absolutely.
Now it's showing that we're not isolated anymore.
That's a great... See, that's what I want to emphasize to you. This is not the pendulum swinging to isolationism. This is the pendulum swinging towards a different kind of involvement.
Yes.
You know, not a military involvement, but certainly an economic involvement here.
And it's still playing out today.
It really is. Now, we are going to see isolationism. You know, and what is isolationism?
Just sit there.
You know, isolationism.
You're by yourself.
Yes, staying by yourself, building like this cartoon shows, which I love from the 1930s. He has done what? Built a wall around the entire country, right? We got a wall around the entire country, and we've got, this is in the 1930s, we got cannons all around the wall to keep everyone out, because outside is dangerous. Now, we're not going to see this kind of isolationism until the 30s. You don't see it in the 20s, but you're going to see it in the 30s. And the reason for it is going to be this change that occurs with the Great Depression.
We're going to need more people in here.
Well,
we haven't got enough jobs as it is.
Well, remember, every time it goes, we swing to real extreme isolationism. You know, people are scared. There are internal issues that have caused people to be really uneasy. You know, and that's what's happening in the Great Depression. You know, we've got this horrendous swing economic, absolute economic collapse. And of course, if y'all know about, some of y'all know more than others, and some of y'all know a lot more than me. You know, with this Great Depression, you got all kinds of things going, and the response of poor Herbert Hoover, who was a progressive Republican, wasn't a conservative. Herbert Hoover was a progressive, but handled it in a typical Republican way. You know, it made it worse. You know, things got worse as a result. What's the trigger of the Great Depression? Well, that's going to be that's going to be the trigger. That's going to be the light, the match that ignites the fuse. But there's all kinds of problems, all kinds of problems that are leading up. You know, it's like what ends up causing the Great Recession. You know, in 2007. You know, it's a great, huge bubble. You know, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and bubbles always burst. They always do. And that's what we got with the Great Depression. You know, it's a bubble that absolutely bursts. And when it does, the economy is just absolutely devastated. And instead of doing it, it's going to be devastated anyway. There are things that they could have done maybe that would have helped, certainly would have helped people, you know, if not the economy. But they choose not to do it. Herbert Hoover's a progressive Republican. He gets a lot of blame for it, and it's, you know, but he responds in a Republican way. You know, as soon as industries have trouble, you know, they're laying people off. You know, because they can't sell their product. You know, Hoover's thinking, how can we get American companies to sell more product? There's an easy way to do it.
Export.
Slap a tariff on imports. You know, let's prevent more imports from coming in. You know, we'll make people buy American cars by slapping an import on a tariff on foreign cars. You know, the only trouble is it doesn't work. You know, it ends up. You know, it didn't work then. It's even worse now because, you know, American industries need foreign parts and equipment is even more then, but it doesn't work.
Well, this happened in Britain and the other countries too.
Absolutely, they all slap on retaliatory tariffs. So we slap a tariff on something coming from Britain, and Britain slaps a tariff on something that's coming from us.
Yeah.
And because Britain isn't stupid, they slap a tariff on something that's going to really hurt us. They're not going to slap a tariff on something that we don't care about. It's going to hurt our industry. And that's what happens all over the world.
What's happening now with China?
Well, yes. Yes. And it's about to happen with the EU. You know, as they're going to put more product, put a tariff on more product. That's economics. That's what people do.
That's simplistic.
It is simplistic. It's mercantile. You're working with assumptions in mercantilism, which no longer, I don't think, are valid, but some people still believe.
But this time after World War I, up until the beginning of the Great Depression, this country had made this like huge jump. They didn't call it the Roaring '20s for nothing.
Right.
They made this huge jump in industrial production. I mean, we went from an agriculture society to a industrial society in like this really short time, and everybody's standard of living is increased. Everybody's buying cars. I mean, we went from horse and buggy to cars.
Right.
We got airplanes, and all this it grew so fast it just went crazy and it died.
And part of the reason it grew fast is because money was so available. You know, money was so available to speculate.
Oh yeah.
And that we talked about, y'all who were in the thing I dealt with, capitalism and socialism. A socialist would say that's one of the problems with capitalism. You know, that the speculator makes huge amounts of money, but does what?
Nothing.
Nothing. Doesn't produce anything. You know, he doesn't produce anything.
Just like the people that buy money on or invest in futures.
Yeah, absolutely. You're not producing anything. You really aren't. But you're making huge amounts of money. You know, a Soviet would look at this and say, "This is the problem. This is the problem. That's what you're going to have to deal with in capitalist society. You deal with depressions and recessions." Okay. All right. So we have this Great Depression. We got the election. Hoover taking textbook Republican approaches to dealing with this. You know, slapping on tariffs. He's cutting taxes. You know, he's doing what he believes is right. Election of 1932. Who wins?
Roosevelt.
Roosevelt wins because he's going to offer the people New Deal. Yeah. Well, what's fascinating with it, I think, as you look at the Great Depression, is that maybe the most important thing Roosevelt did was hope. You know, that I believe things are going to get better. You know, going from Hoover, and poor Hoover was really working hard, but things aren't getting better. Roosevelt, before he did anything, he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The Depression is not scary. We shouldn't be afraid of this Depression. We'll handle that.
Wrong.
We'll get ahead on that. What's that?
Wrong.
Now, if enough people said wrong, you know, then Roosevelt's in big trouble. But if enough people say, oh, springtime in America, you know, springtime in America, oh, that feels good, you know, then it's going to work. Oh, let's return to normalcy. It's going to work, and Roosevelt does a lot of things, but you know, he approaches it in a typically democratic way. You know, Hoover approaches it through industry. Roosevelt's going to approach it through people. It's going to approach it through people.
But one of the interesting things that he did was, instead of just being pure socialist and just giving money to people to, you know, get so they could eat and so forth, no. He created jobs and people were getting paychecks and they felt like they were actually doing something.
Right, exactly. And yes.
That was important.
But it was still social.
But the unemployment rate didn't drop dramatically until we started getting on a war footing.
There is.
So I mean,
That's the best way to get out of any depression.
There is really, really good, I think, solid support. I shouldn't say evidence. It's more support that the Depression, some of Roosevelt's policies caused the Depression to go longer than it should have. Because in past, these economic blips always, this is not unusual. You know, they occur and you get through them. Now, they're horrible. What Roosevelt did, and this is typical Jeffersonian philosophy, you know, go back to Jefferson. You know, when people are suffering, you deal with the suffering. You don't deal with the industrial structure. You deal with the suffering. And that's what he did. And that may be one of the things, again, back to that one we did with capitalism and socialism. You know, what Roosevelt did was sort of socialism light. You know, giving them jobs rather than just giving them money. But he was creating jobs. The government was creating jobs and was funding jobs. You know, were they actually producing something you could sell?
No, they weren't. Their infrastructure and everything good.
Yeah, well,
doing a lot of good.
But a Republican would say, you know, what you've done is you've taken that away from a company that's going to hire those people to do it.
Right.
You know, you're taking that away from them. If you just let the economy readjust, you know, you go through these hard times, it's collapsed, the money's gone, what you're going to do is you're going to rebuild. And a Democrat's going to say, but the pain is too great here, we've got to address the pain. And that's the difference. I'm not saying one's right and the other's wrong, one's better, the other's worse. It depends on where you are on the spectrum. You know, if you're comfortable, man, you like this. You know, if you're unemployed, you know, you're going to favor that. Or if your kids are hungry.
Yeah, but those projects that the government funded would be like the space NASA today.
Right.
They were too big for a private corporation.
Right.
You know, the Hoover Dam, these things that the government sponsored there wasn't enough capital around to fund them.
What the Republicans say then, when they're funded, is we don't need them. If we needed them, the market will determine if we need it. If we really need it, the market will tell us.
Well,
you know, that's a philosophical difference. You know, that
electrifying the nation.
Tennessee Valley, right? But like I said, the Republicans would say waste of money. That should be done by private enterprise. Shouldn't be public. Should be private. If we really need it, we'll find private financing to do it that will work for a profit and will do the job efficiently and yada, yada, yada. It's a difference in philosophy. And we can debate the philosophy, and I'm not even taking either side. You know, I'm just saying it's a philosophical difference. Yeah.
What year was the Dust Bowl? Because you know,
Oh,
we were
Dust-
stuck with that.
Yeah, the
That
Dust
was
Bowl. The Dust Bowl starts. The Dust Bowl is starting in the mid-20s. You know, we start seeing the beginning of the Dust Bowl.
Bill and everything,
Yeah.
So that was part of. like,
Absolutely.
But that was.
You know, absolutely. You know, I said it, but with the cap, you know, a hyper-capitalist would say, let them die and decrease the surplus population. You know, that's what a hyper-capitalist would say. You know, and that's, if that's what you believe, you know, you're probably, you could argue, yes, yes. Okay, but this is about foreign policy. So we get this election, we got a Democratic president. Really, this is when we start moving into real isolationism in the 1930s. Now you could say we're moving into it because our concerns are so great, you know, and we can, you know, blame the Germans for defaulting on their loan payments and other allies. We can blame foreign, but this is when isolationism really kicks in. Now, one of the things that's very interesting, yeah, isolation kicks in. Intervention in Latin America stops. We adopt a whole new philosophy in dealing with Latin America. What was the philosophy before Franklin Roosevelt, before the Democrats take charge? We see a little bit with, we see the same thing though with Wilson, with his moral diplomacy. William Jennings Bryan, moral diplomacy, we need to help countries elect good people to serve. You know, that was Wilson's policy in Latin America. You know, then we go back to really an interventionist, sending troops in, you know, taking care of Pancho Villa in northern Mexico. Boy, we're going to be more involved. We go back to a more intervention. We were intervening. We enter what's called, under Franklin Roosevelt, a policy called the good neighbor policy. You ever heard of the good neighbor policy? What becomes the basis for the good neighbor policy in the 30s? We're looking at Latin America. We're looking at the Caribbean. Just by the name, good neighbor policy,
Be nice to your neighbor.
we are going to be good neighbors.
Good neighbors.
You know, we're going to be good neighbors. Instead of viewing them as areas where we can call the shots. Remember the Roosevelt corollary, you know, that says we have the right to intervene anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. We want to intervene. Europeans can't, but we can. You know, now we're saying we're not going to treat Mexico, you know, like a protectorate. We're not going to treat Cuba like a protectorate. You know, we're not going to be constantly intervening in Central America. You know, when, you know, a new government comes and confiscates, you know, American property. We're not going to do that anymore. Instead, we're going to deal with them as equals. We're going to be a good neighbor to Latin American countries. And one of the, you know, examples, the government, and this is really cool, commissions Walt Disney to produce a movie in the 30s, and it's one of the first feature-length cartoons. You see, Snow White is the first. You know, they are like in this golden age of Disney. You had Snow White, you had Dumbo, you had Pinocchio, which are the early ones. You know, before, yeah, before the, but these are feature movies. The other one is The Three Amigos.
Yeah.
And you don't hear it much, but it's about Latin America.
Yeah.
You know, these Disney characters in Latin America. And this is to symbolize our new relationship with these Hispanic countries to the south. We are going to we don't want to make them American anymore. What we want to do is we want to appreciate their culture. You know, so we're going to celebrate in a very Disney Western way, well, Northern European way. We're going to celebrate Hispanic culture. You know, whoa! You know, this is not the Frito Bandito. You know, it's not. You know, it's not the Frito Bandito view. This is good neighbor.
Yeah.
You know, and this is a Roosevelt policy.
Were they Mexican mice? What was?
No, they actually, it was Donald Duck. Donald Duck was one of them. There was a parrot that was one of them. Yeah. But they were all, they weren't, the main characters were Americans, Northerners, that go south. So the parrot wasn't
Was it in
a
Spanish?
Spanish. No, it was in English, but it was for English audiences. Well, and it was translated. There are Spanish versions, but it was, to help Americans at the theater appreciate, Spanish.
So was this like a short?
No, this was feature. This was a feature-length movie. This was a 90-minute movie. And what's amazing is to appreciate this culture so that we don't look at Latin America as an uncivilized place that we need to bring up to our level. But that this is a culture that is different but has equal validity. You can't be a good neighbor when you look at your neighbor and say, boy, those are disgusting people over there. Look at what they eat, how they talk. I don't have anything to do with that. It's hard to be a good neighbor.
Well, we eat all our stuff.
Weren't most of the American countries dictatorships at this time?
Well, really not. There are dictatorships, but Perón is later.
Okay.
Most of
I do know that Brazil was essentially a dictatorship.
most of the Latin countries have so much. They owe Western Europe, so much money, particularly the British in loans, that at this point they don't want to antagonize, the Western Europe.
Okay.
And Western Europe needs the money too. So they don't want to antagonize. Most of them are democracy-like. They have elections, but the British, particularly the British, are shaping the elections. It's going to be later when Perón takes power. Perón's going to take power in '44. That they're going to start. These countries are going to start breaking connections with the Western powers for a lot of reasons. One, the Western powers can't loan them money anymore, because they're in the middle of a war, and so they're going to start confiscating because you can get away with it. The British aren't going to resist when you confiscate British property, in Argentina.
We should show this cartoon, this feature now, nationwide.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe, but it's a little like learning French culture from Pepe Le Pew. And I don't want to.
But it's better than nothing.
Well, it might be better than nothing. It certainly. That's what I said. It shows Hispanic culture in a very Disney and Northern European way. Respectful.
But so it was non-confrontational. So
it was non-confrontational, but it was a lot of flamingo dancing.
Well, it might.
It wouldn't work in today's world.
Yeah, people eating, happy folks eating tacos, and I think some people now would call it racist. Then it was really progressive. This was really cutting edge, because we'd always looked at Latin America as a place where that was our background. That was our backyard. We could pretty much do anything we want, and the natives are irrelevant. And now we're saying no. There's reason to show them. So we need to be neighbors instead of landlords.
But still, we were certainly isolationists.
Oh, absolutely. Well, this is a way to be isolationist. This is a sign of isolationism.
Yeah, it's okay to leave them
Yeah.
to do their thing, and we'll do our
Right,
thing.
because good nature says we're going to take a step back. We don't want to be involved in your economy anymore. We don't want to be sending Marines down. When things get out of hand. We're going to be your neighbor, and if you need us, we'll be there to give you support. But we're not going to pay your bills anymore. The dollar diplomacy was we could buy Latin America. We're not going to do that anymore. So it's a very isolationist perspective. Sort of the same thing Bryant said way back before the Spanish-American War. Countries should have the right to run their own affairs, and that's what we're saying with the good neighbor policy. At this time, we've got a rise of fascism and extreme hypernationalism in Europe. Okay, and so what's happening in Europe? We're in the 30s. What's occurring in Europe?
They got a depression too.
Well, they got a depression.
Well, the Spanish Civil War starts.
Okay, we're going to get to that in just a second. You know, we've got even before that, because we're looking at 33, what happens in 33? Hitler is appointed by the president of Germany.
Hindenburg.
No, that's right. Nazi Party wins a majority in the Reichstag. Hitler is appointed by Hindenburg to be Chancellor of Germany. What's that?
Mussolini's a dictator.
Mussolini has been a dictator in Italy for 10 years.
Right.
You know, so he's in Italy. Hitler becomes appointed chancellor, not only with the support of the Nazi Party, but the support of a whole, not the army yet. The army doesn't like Hitler at all, you know, initially. He gets support from all these right-wing parties. A lot of right-wing parties. A lot of them, Hindenburg is a monarchist. Hindenburg's assumption, because, you know, the Kaiser's family is still around. Hindenburg's assumption is that when he leaves, a new Kaiser will move in. You know, so Hindenburg's a monarchist. And we got all, but they're conservative. Let's go back to another time. And they're all supporting Hitler because everybody knows we can control it, right? Von Papen, who was a former chancellor of Germany, wasn't a Nazi member of the Nazi Party. Von Papen. You know, he's going to be vice chancellor under Adolf Hitler, the first vice chancellor. Hitler can be controlled. In fact, Hitler's first cabinet doesn't even have a majority Nazi representation, because these other little small parties, right-wing parties, also have people in the cabinet, because Hitler and the Nazis can be controlled. And so he is appointed chancellor of Germany. And soon after, a rather pivotal event occurs in Germany. The Reichstag catches fire and burns to the ground, and immediately Mexicans are blamed. No, I'm sorry, not Mexicans. Immediately, communists are blamed. Communists are blamed. And the Reichstag passes the Enabling Act, which gives the Chancellor the power to create legislation. And even though Hindenburg's still alive, now Adolf Hitler is the Chancellor, is the focus. Hindenburg dies. The Reichstag says, why do we need a president and a Chancellor? Let's combine the two into one. And so we combine the Reich president with the Chancellor into one office, and we're going to rename that office simple name. Instead of having president and having chancellor, we just call that person the leader. Leader. In German, Führer. You know, we're going to make that person leader, the leader. And so that's Hitler. What's interesting, and this is real fast, a little aside, you know, when Hitler, at the end of the war, when Hitler commits suicide, he writes out a will. And part of the will is to designate the people who will follow him in these offices. And what he does, after 1934, the Chancellor in the German Reich, the Chancellor and the President will be one person. The offices are combined. And while Hitler is in charge up until 1935, April 1935, they're one office. He is both Chancellor and President combined in as the leader. What he does, though, in fact, they're still working under the old Constitution. They don't change. The Nazis don't change the fundamental Constitution. They just don't follow it. The Constitution still has two offices. And what Hitler does in his last will is he divides the offices again. And he appoints a person to be the right president. And it's going to be a man named Dönitz. He's Admiral Dönitz. And he's the one that was in charge of the wolf packs. You know, the submarine wolf packs. Grand Admiral. And Hitler appoints him as the right president and appoints Joseph Goebbels as chancellor. The thing is, Goebbels
Commit
Commit
suicide.
suicide.
Not only does he commit suicide, but he and his wife Magda give poison to their daughters. And their daughters die. She takes poison, dies. He shoots himself because they didn't want their children to live in a world without Adolf. So they kill their daughters. But now that the chancellor is gone, all you've got is the right president. But Dönitz is never Führer. He is never leader. He is the president of this increasingly shrinking German Reich. You know, and he's president for like 3-4 weeks. You know. But there was even talk about continuing it, you know, just for stability, as Germany is a basket case. You know, who is going to collect the garbage? Who's going to run the local affairs? So, you know, he wants to negotiate a settlement, but fails. He's sentenced, but isn't sentenced to die at Nuremberg, which is kind of interesting, and ends up being released and lives life after. Grand Admiral. So we got a rise of fascism, and talking about this, the Spanish Civil War. And what is significant? What becomes really significant in the Spanish Civil
The
War?
Nazis supplied Franco, and the Russians supplied the Republic.
Yeah, we got a republic in Spain that is left of center, a leftist republic in Spain, and just like it's happening all over in other places in Europe, we have kind of an insurgency. Only this time it's military. The general in charge of Spanish troops in North Africa, Franco, you know, he's leading a Phalanges revolution, and he's in Spain. So we end up with the Civil War, and it's drawing, both Italy and Germany use the Civil War sort of as a proxy war to test out a lot of their strategy and equipment. Germany, with his air power, the Italians are sending troops into Spain. You know, so it becomes kind of a thing. And the Soviets are supporting the Republic, but the Soviets are a mess. A lot of little groups, including in the United States, you know, organize the Lincoln Brigade from the United States goes to fight in the Spanish Civil War. And who is taking notes? Hemingway is taking notes with the Lincoln Brigade, you know, during the Spanish Civil War. But the United States, and even when there's pressure, the United States needs to intervene. We need to supply the rebels. Franklin Roosevelt says,
No, we don't.
No, we don't. No, we don't. The Germans and Italians are supplying the rebels. We should be supplying the Republic. They're a republic, for crying out loud. And Franklin Roosevelt says, absolutely not. Let's work on our problems first. Let's work on the problems here first.
What is the Phalanges Revolution you just said?
That was the name of the party. That was the name of Franco's party.
Phalanges.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had the solar system and all.
That was 5 years old.
Yeah. And you can still find, you know, in the United States, you know, there's a Phalanges party, because Franco and Hitler had a different philosophy, and it was really interesting. But and in Spain you still have that. Okay, so this is right now the pendulum. We swung internationalist. Now we're swinging back to home isolationism. Interesting that with Wilson did the same thing with his moral diplomacy and his progressive policies, his new freedom. Here, what's going to happen is something's going to kick the pendulum over. With Wilson, it's going to be World War I. Something's going to kick the pendulum with Franklin Roosevelt, and it's going to be World War Part II. Yes, and that's what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about that, and then immediately after, what happens immediately after the war. Okay? So, go home.
No, I go home and meet Amy and Jimmy for lunch, and I have to go get to Walmart and get some prescriptions. So,
Oh, it's probably a lot.
I went right past the post office. I wanted to put my bills in the outside thing.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Yes, I gotta do that. Thank you again, you guys.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, that's what you
No,
want.
that's exactly what I want.
Yeah.
You know, that's one of the nicest things I've heard. You know, I want y'all to think, but I also want y'all to have
Fussing, fussing.
good.